Mud churned red beneath the feet of exhausted English archers. The field of Agincourt was a scene of improbable victory and terrible slaughter in the year 1415. This is the history you think you know, but what if that famous battle and the entire century-long war it was part of was fought for reasons you never learned in school? What if kings and queens were chasing secret ambitions far beyond a simple crown? Today, we will pull back the curtain on the 100 Years' War to reveal the hidden economic schemes, the personal kingdoms, and the shocking betrayals that truly kept the conflict burning for 116 years. You will discover the real puppet masters behind the thrones. We will uncover why a French duke would betray his own king to side with England, and how bankers in Italy grew rich by funding both sides of the same war. By the end, you will see this medieval epic not as a patriotic struggle, but as a complex web of covert agendas. What you believe is the most powerful hidden motive for starting a war, the official story, begins with a tangled family tree and a king's bold claim. In the year 1328, the last direct male heir to the French throne, Charles IV, died without a son. His closest male relative was his cousin, Philip of Valois, who swiftly took the crown as Philip VI. But across the English Channel, a young King Edward III saw things differently. His mother was Isabella, the daughter of a previous French king, Philip IV, and sister to the recently deceased Charles. Through her, Edward believed he had a legitimate right to the entire Kingdom of France. It was a dynastic bombshell that shattered the peace between the two nations. The French court, however, had a legal shield ready. They invoked something called Salic Law, an ancient Frankish code they reinterpreted to mean that the crown could never pass through a woman, nor could it be inherited by anyone whose claim came from a female line. This law, they declared, made Edward's claim utterly invalid. Philip was the rightful king by male-only succession. This is the classic textbook explanation you will find in any history book. A king claims a throne he believes is his by blood. Another king refuses with the power of ancient law, and the drums of war begin to beat. It is a clean, almost logical story of royal inheritance gone wrong, supported by maps showing English holdings in France and intricate charts of royal genealogy. But if this legal dispute was the only true cause, why did the war last for more than a century, spanning multiple generations and consuming countless lives? The answer is that the dynastic claim was merely the public banner under which far darker and more lucrative motives marched to war. Beneath the surface of royal heraldry and legal decrees, a far more tangible force was pulling England toward war. It was soft, warm, and astonishingly valuable English wool. The sheep grazing on the hills of England and Wales produced the finest, most sought-after wool in all of Europe. This was not merely a commodity, it was the cornerstone of England's entire economy and the secret engine of its military power. The Crown's greatest source of revenue came from taxing the massive exports of this raw wool, which were shipped across the Channel to a region desperate for it, Flanders. Today, Flanders is part of Belgium, but in the 14th century, it was a collection of wealthy, semi-independent cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres. These were the industrial powerhouses of the medieval world, their looms constantly humming, turning English wool into luxurious cloth that was sold for enormous profits across the continent. The Flemish weavers were utterly dependent on English wool, and the English kings were utterly dependent on the taxes from selling it to them. This created a fragile, vital economic alliance that sat right on the doorstep of France. The French monarchy viewed these rich Flemish cities as rebellious subjects who rightfully belonged under the French crown, and they repeatedly tried to bring them to heel. For England, this was an existential threat. If France controlled Flanders, it could strangle England's economy by cutting off its best customer or imposing crushing tariffs. So when King Edward III raised his banner and claimed the French throne, he was not just pursuing a dynastic fantasy. he was launching a preemptive strike in an economic war. His claim was a political weapon designed to protect the wool trade. By declaring himself the rightful king of France, Edward could position himself as the legitimate overlord of Flanders, securing the loyalty of the Flemish cities who feared French domination. He even incorporated the Flemish emblem, the Black Lion, into his own royal arms to cement this alliance. The money that poured into the English treasury from wool was the very fuel for the armies he sent to France. This was a circular, self-financing machine of conflict. Tax the wool to pay for soldiers, use the soldiers to protect the trade routes and alliances that let you keep taxing the wool. Economic pressure was a deliberate strategy. English raids into France were not only about capturing castles, they were about burning crops, disrupting markets, and crippling the French king's ability to fund his own defenses. The goal was to make war so financially exhausting for France that it would collapse from within. So the next time you picture a medieval knight, see not just the armor and the sword, but the countless sheep whose wool paid for it all. This war was fought for fleece as much as for flags. This web of wool and war required a willing partner on the continent, and Flanders was desperate for a friend. The wealthy burghers and skilled weavers of cities like Ghent had grown tired of their French overlords, who saw them not as partners but as piggy banks to be cracked open. French counts imposed heavy taxes and meddled in the city's lucrative trade, threatening the very autonomy that had made Flanders rich. When the Count of Flanders, Louis of Nevers, remained stubbornly loyal to the French king, the Flemish people saw their economic lifeline, the English wool supply, being put in jeopardy. So they did the unthinkable. They rose up against their own count, not for freedom in some abstract sense, but for the very practical freedom to keep buying English wool and selling their cloth. Into this volatile situation stepped a charismatic and ruthless leader from Ghent, a wealthy merchant named Jacob van Artevelde. He was not a nobleman, but a man of commerce who understood that Flanders' survival depended on England. Van Artevelde became the de facto ruler of Flanders, and he made a cold, calculated decision. He reached out directly to King Edward III of England. The offer was simple. Flanders would recognize Edward as the true King of France, breaking allegiance to Philip VI if Edward guaranteed their wool supply and supported their rebellion. For Edward, this was a masterstroke. He was not just gaining a trading partner, he was gaining a client state. By backing Van Artevelde, Edward effectively turned the entire county of Flanders into an English proxy, a dagger pointed at the heart of France from the north. It was a foothold on the continent far more valuable than any captured castle. English armies could now be supplied and reinforced through Flemish ports. The economic alliance had become a full military partnership. King Edward even traveled to Ghent in the year 1340, where he was hailed as the rightful king, and where his son, the future Black Prince, was born. The scene was a powerful piece of political theatre, showcasing a kingdom run by merchants choosing an English king over a French one. But this hidden agenda was a double-edged sword. Van Artevelde's power relied entirely on his ability to deliver prosperity, and when a temporary truce between England and France briefly threatened the flow of wool and trade, his support crumbled. He was killed by a mob in Ghent in the year 1345, a grim reminder that these economic alliances were built on shifting sand, yet the pattern was set. The English crown had learned it could use economic necessity to create political loyalty far beyond its borders, turning entire regions into weapons against France. This was not a war of chivalry, but a war of supply chains. But the wool trade was not the only source of immense wealth and power being contested. There was another institution whose influence spanned all of Europe, an institution that controlled not just souls, but vast treasuries and the very legitimacy of kings. That institution was the Catholic Church, and in the year 1378 it tore itself in two. This was the Western Schism, a 40-year period where not one, but two men claimed to be the true pope, each with his own court, his own cardinals, and his own loyal kings. One pope reigned from Rome, the other, a rival pope, set up his lavish court in Avignon, a city in southern France that was effectively under French control. This religious catastrophe became the perfect covert battleground for the 100 Years' War. France naturally threw its full support behind the Pope in Avignon. England, just as predictably, declared its allegiance to the Pope in Rome. On the surface, this was a matter of faith and doctrine, but beneath the holy vestments, it was pure power politics. Each king now had a pope in his pocket, a spiritual authority he could wield like a weapon. The French could claim God himself sanctioned their king through the Avignon pontiff. The English could do the same with their Roman pope. This meant each side could portray the other as not just a political enemy, but a heretic fighting against God's chosen vicar. It provided a divine justification for continued slaughter. The practical benefits were even more tempting. A supportive pope could grant a king extraordinary powers. He could excommunicate the enemy king and his entire nation, cutting them off from the sacraments and turning them into spiritual outcasts. This was a terrifying prospect in a profoundly religious age, and it could demoralize an army and turn a population against their own ruler. More crucially, a pope could open the treasury of the church. He could grant a king the right to collect special taxes from the clergy within his lands, or to take a portion of the tithes that normally flowed to Rome or Avignon. For a king perpetually starving for funds to pay soldiers and build fleets, this was a financial miracle. The war, funded by wool, could now also be funded by the collection plate. So the schism locked the conflict into a deadly stalemate. Neither side could afford to see their pope lose, because it would mean losing divine favor and a vital river of gold. The war to control France had become entangled with a war to control heaven itself. This hidden agenda turned every battlefield into a holy crusade for the right price. These rival popes provided the official blessing, but the battle for hearts and minds was fought with more personal symbols. Every soldier and peasant needed a saint to fight for, a tangible piece of heaven to carry into the chaos. For England, that saint was George. He was not even English by origin, a Roman soldier martyred far away, but his story was perfect for war. Here was a holy warrior who slew a dragon, a champion of good against overwhelming evil. King Edward III made St. George the patron saint of England and of his new chivalric order, the Order of the Garter, deliberately crafting an image of righteous, divinely backed knighthood. English armies went into battle shouting his name, their banners bearing his red cross, a constant visual prayer for victory. It was brilliant propaganda, transforming a foreign mercenary army on French soil into God's own crusaders. France had its own powerful celestial protector, Saint Denis. According to legend, this 3rd century bishop was martyred outside Paris, and after his beheading, picked up his own head and walked several miles, preaching a sermon the entire way. He became the patron saint of the French monarchy, and his abbey just north of Paris was the burial place of kings. The battle cry of the French army was Montjoy Saint Denis. To carry the banner of Saint Denis was to carry the very soul of France itself, a symbol of a kingdom that would endure any blow and keep fighting. When the French lost battles, it was seen not just as a military failure, but as a spiritual crisis, a sign that Saint Denis had turned his face away. The pressure to regain his favor was immense. This war of saints extended to the veneration of holy relics, physical objects believed to hold divine power. Kings and commanders would go to great lengths to possess them. Before the Battle of Agincourt, King Henry V of England spent an entire day in prayer and had his army's path lined with sacred relics, seeking every ounce of heavenly advantage. Relics were more than objects of faith. They were psychological weapons and morale boosters. To have a fragment of the true cross or a bone of a martyr in your camp was to have God physically present in your ranks. It convinced common soldiers they were not just paid fighters, but participants in a holy cause. The side with the better relics, it was believed, had the better connection to heaven. This is the charged world a young peasant girl from Domremy entered. Joan of Arc did not appear in a vacuum. She was a product of a culture saturated with the language of saints and divine intervention. When she began hearing the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret telling her to drive the English from France, her message resonated precisely because it fit an existing template. The French court, desperate after decades of defeat, was willing to test this potential miracle, but they were also cautious politicians. Before giving her an army, they subjected her to rigorous theological examinations. They were not just testing her faith, they were testing her utility. Once satisfied, they clothed her in white armor, gave her a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, and sent her forth as a living, breathing relic. She was the ultimate piece of propaganda, a sign that God had finally answered the prayers to Saint Denis. Her stunning victories, like the relief of Orleans, were framed not as military achievements but as divine miracles, proof that France's cause was sacred. Her subsequent capture, trial, and execution by the English were equally strategic. By having her condemned as a heretic by a church court loyal to their pope, the English aimed to shatter the French morale she had built to prove her divine favor was a demonic fraud. In the end, both sides used Joan not just as a commander, but as a symbol in their century-long war for the command of heaven itself. Even divine favor could not pay an army's wages. While saints and symbols fought in the heavens, a far more earthly struggle for power was unfolding in the sun-drenched vineyards of southwestern France. It was here that the war's greatest hero revealed a hidden ambition that would ultimately unravel England's fortunes. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was the shining star of the English cause. His crushing victory at Poitiers in 1356, where he captured the French king himself, made him a legend across Europe. He was the ideal medieval knight, a paragon of chivalry and martial genius. But the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 offered him something beyond glory. It offered him a kingdom of his own. In exchange for renouncing his father's claim to the French throne, England was granted full sovereignty, not just lordship, over a vast swath of territory in southwestern France, a region known as Aquitaine. This was not to be another province ruled from London. King Edward III bestowed this enormous land upon his son as a personal fiefdom, a semi-independent principality. The Black Prince moved his court to Bordeaux, adopting the lavish style of a sovereign ruler. He held his own parliament, minted his own coins, and created his own chivalric order. On the surface, this was the reward for a valiant son, but look closer and you see a secret agenda taking shape. The Black Prince was not building an outpost of England. He was building the kingdom of Edward. He envisioned a powerful, autonomous realm in the heart of France, loyal to him personally, a legacy separate from the crown his older brother would one day inherit. This dream, however, required a fortune. Maintaining a glittering court and garrisoning dozens of castles was staggeringly expensive, so the prince turned to the people of Aquitaine with a heavy hand. He imposed the fouage, a harsh hearth tax that demanded payment from every household. For a population already weary from decades of war and brigandage, this was the final straw. The towns and lords of Aquitaine had accepted English rule for the peace and trade it promised, not for impoverishment by a foreign prince they saw as a tax collector. Resentment simmered, then boiled over. In 1368, the powerful Lord of Albret, a key vassal, refused to pay. When the Black Prince summoned him to court to answer for this defiance, he did not come. Instead, he and many other disgruntled nobles sent a secret appeal for justice to a new, cunning king in Paris, Charles V. They were not declaring love for France. They were seeking relief from a prince they viewed as a tyrannical outsider. This was the fatal crack in the English edifice. The Black Prince's personal kingdom, built on ambition and funded by oppression, had driven its own subjects back into the arms of the French crown. His response was to demand his father restart the war, leading to a brutal, devastating campaign that left him sick and broken. He would return to England empty-handed, his health ruined, his principality in revolt, and his dream of a private kingdom in ashes. The greatest English warrior of his age was ultimately defeated not on the battlefield, but by the quiet, relentless arithmetic of his own ambition. The vineyards and castles of Aquitaine were home to lords facing an impossible choice. These Gascon nobles lived in a world where the map was drawn in shifting ink. For generations, they had sworn oaths of fealty to the English king, their overlord for the rich wine trade that flowed from Bordeaux to London. Yet they spoke the Languedoc, shared borders with French lords, and intermarried with families who answered to Paris. Their loyalty was not to a nation, for nations as we know them did not yet exist. Their loyalty was to their own stone keeps, their vineyard rows, and the ancient privileges inscribed on brittle parchment. When the Black Prince raised his harsh taxes, he was not just demanding money. He was threatening the very autonomy these nobles had always prized. The tax was a signal that their status as valued partners was over. They were now being treated as conquered subjects, their wealth a treasury for a foreign prince's personal glory. This was a breach of the feudal contract, a deep betrayal of the mutual obligation between lord and vassal. So the Lord of Albret and his allies made a coldly practical calculation. They sent their secret appeal to King Charles V of France, not out of sudden patriotism, but as a strategic maneuver. It was a test. They wanted to see which master would offer them the better deal, which king would promise to protect their lands, honor their local authority, and lighten their financial burdens. This was a high-stakes game of playing both sides, and for a time it worked brilliantly. The French crown, under the shrewd Charles V, was happy to welcome these powerful defectors. He offered them pensions, confirmed their titles, and treated them as esteemed allies returning to the fold. For the Gascon lords, this was simply good business. They were swapping an oppressive overlord for a distant and perhaps more lenient one. Their castles changed banners, but their fundamental goal remained unchanged. Survival, preservation, the continuity of their own house above all else. This pattern repeated for over a century. A local lord would find his privileges under threat by an English administrator, or see a chance for gain by switching sides, and he would conveniently remember his deep-rooted French heritage. Conversely, if a French royal official grew too demanding, that same lord might suddenly recall the favorable trade terms under English rule and send a feeler back to Bordeaux. Their allegiance was a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder who offered the most freedom. This turned the long war into a slow, grinding struggle of bribery and local diplomacy, where winning a castle through marriage or a secret treaty was often as important as winning it through siege. The great armies that clashed at Crécy or Agincourt were the spectacular explosions, but the true war was this silent, constant seepage of loyalties in the regions between them. The kings in London and Paris were not just fighting each other. They were engaged in a perpetual auction, bidding for the loyalty of a nobility whose only true country was their own estate. While Gascon lords bartered their loyalty for local advantage, a far greater power was quietly assembling its own kingdom in the shadows. The Dukes of Burgundy began the war as loyal French princes, but they ended it as architects of a betrayal so profound it nearly erased France from the map. Their agenda was not to win the war for England, but to use the war to win a crown for themselves. Their story starts with a vast inheritance. Through a series of strategic marriages and fortunate deaths, the dukes amassed lands that stretched from the heart of France to the borders of Germany, a rich tapestry of territories including prosperous Flanders, Brabant, and the county of Burgundy itself. They commanded more wealth than the King of France. Their courts were centers of art and culture that outshone Paris, and their armies were formidable. The dukes, in essence, were kings in everything but name, and that final step, the royal title, was the one thing the Valois king in Paris would never, ever grant them. A deep, poisonous rivalry festered. It crystallized into civil war around the year 1410, when France fractured into two murderous factions. On one side stood the Armagnacs, loyal to the mentally unstable King Charles VI and the Dauphin, his son. On the other stood the Burgundians, led by the charismatic and ambitious Duke John the Fearless. This was not a polite political disagreement, it was a vendetta. In 1407, Duke John ordered the brutal assassination of his chief rival, the king's brother Louis of Orleans, on a darkened Paris street. The Orleanist faction, now led by the Count of Armagnac, swore vengeance. The streets of Paris ran with the blood of both factions as they slaughtered each other's supporters. Into this cauldron of French self-destruction stepped the young, fiercely capable King Henry V of England. He saw not a unified kingdom to conquer, but a carcass to be carved up. His stunning victory at Agincourt in 1415 was a disaster for the Armagnacs, who bore the brunt of the defeat. But for the Burgundians, it was an opportunity. The new Burgundian Duke, Philip the Good, son of the assassinated John, now faced a choice. He could unite with the Armagnacs and the Dauphin to repel the English invader, or he could use the English to destroy his mortal enemies once and for all. His hatred for the Armagnacs, whom he blamed for his father's death, consumed all other loyalties. In the year 1419, during negotiations, the Dauphin's men committed a catastrophic error. They lured Duke Philip to a bridge at Montereau for talks, and there they murdered his father's killer, but in the process they struck Duke Philip himself. He escaped, but the message was seared into his mind. The Armagnac faction was irredeemable, so Philip the Good made his historic, cold-blooded decision. He would ally with the enemy of France to destroy the enemy of Burgundy. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This document was a Burgundian masterpiece of political annihilation. It declared the Dauphin Charles unfit to rule, blaming him for his father's madness and the Montereau assassination. It disinherited him entirely. Then, it named King Henry V of England as the heir to the French throne to succeed the ailing Charles VI. To seal the deal, Henry married Charles's daughter, Catherine. On the surface, this was an English triumph, but looked through Burgundian eyes. Philip the Good had no love for Henry V, a stern and formidable soldier king. But Henry's heir was not yet born. The treaty made Henry regent of France, but real power in the north and east, where Burgundian influence was strongest, flowed through Philip. The plan was elegant. A child king, half English and half French, would one day sit on the throne in Paris, a weak monarch who would be dependent on his powerful Burgundian uncle by alliance to manage his unruly French domains. The Duke of Burgundy would become the true power behind two thrones. He would achieve through diplomacy and betrayal what he could never win by open rebellion, a crown under his control. For a few brief years, it seemed this hidden agenda would succeed. Then, Henry V died suddenly in 1422, leaving his crown to a baby, Henry VI. The Duke of Burgundy was now the senior statesman of the dual monarchy, his influence greater than ever. The Kingdom of France, for all intents and purposes, belonged to him. It was the ultimate proof that the longest wars are not always fought for the declared prize, but for the throne waiting in the wings. The Burgundian Duke now ruled a kingdom in all but name. From his dazzling court in Dijon and later Brussels, Philip the Good presided over a realm that stretched from the verdant hills of Burgundy to the bustling ports of Flanders. He maintained his own standing army, a formidable force of disciplined knights and professional infantry that often outmatched the ragged remnants of the French royal host. He conducted his own foreign policy, signing treaties with England, negotiating with the Holy Roman Emperor, and acting as a sovereign equal to any king. His economic network was the envy of Europe, the wealth of the Flemish cloth towns and the Burgundian vineyards flowing directly into his treasury, not that of Paris. This was not a dukedom, it was a sovereign state intentionally constructed in the shadow of a weakened France, a state whose primary agenda was its own survival and expansion. For over a decade, this gamble paid off spectacularly. The English, propped up by Burgundian power, controlled Paris and the north. The disinherited Dauphin, Charles, was a king without a capital, skulking in the Loire Valley with his Armagnac loyalists, mocked as the King of Burges. The Burgundian agenda seemed triumphant, but grand designs built on hatred often contained the seeds of their own collapse. Two things began to shift. First, the English regency governing for the child King Henry VI grew increasingly arrogant and inept, treating their Burgundian allies not as partners but as subordinates. They failed to pay the subsidies promised to Duke Philip, and their commanders began to act like occupiers in lands Philip considered his sphere of influence. The second and far more powerful shift was the arrival of Joan of Arc. Her miraculous string of victories in 1429, culminating in the coronation of Charles VII at Rheims, did more than boost French morale. It changed the political calculus. Charles was no longer a disinherited rebel. He was a consecrated king, anointed with holy oil in the traditional manner. This sacred legitimacy was a force Duke Philip could not easily ignore, especially as whispers grew that his English allies were losing God's favor. The final break came with a combination of cold pragmatism and warm sentiment. By 1435, the English alliance had brought Burgundy little new territory but plenty of expense and frustration. Meanwhile, Charles VII, advised by wiser counselors, made a breathtaking offer. Through secret channels, he offered Duke Philip something the English never could: total and absolute pardon for the murder of his father at Montereau. He accepted full responsibility for the crime, absolving Philip of the need for vengeance. Furthermore, Charles offered to cede vast territories on the Somme River to Burgundian control and exempt the Duke from having to pay homage to the French crown for life. It was an offer of peace with honor, wealth, and autonomy. The Treaty of Arras, signed in September 1435, was the ultimate betrayal from England's perspective. Overnight, the keystone of their French kingdom was pulled away, but for Burgundy, it was a masterstroke. Philip the Good exchanged a failing partnership for guaranteed riches and independence. He abandoned the English cause not out of newfound love for France, but to secure the permanent sovereignty of his own Burgundian state. The English, now isolated and overextended, were left to face a resurgent France alone. Their slow, irreversible expulsion from the continent began that day, not on a battlefield, but at a negotiating table where a duke decided his own crown was more valuable than anyone else's. Burgundy's betrayal left the English crown financially exposed and desperate. To understand how a war could last for 116 years, you must follow the money, a trail that leads not to royal treasuries but to the counting houses of Italy. While kings fought for crowns, a different kind of dynasty was building its empire on ledgers and loans. Families like the Peruzzi, the Bardi, and later the Medici became the hidden architects of the conflict, funding both sides with cold, calculating precision. They were not patriots, they were venture capitalists in a world of armored startups, and the 100 Years' War was their most lucrative investment. A king like Edward III of England had a royal title and a formidable army, but he lacked the one thing necessary to launch an invasion: ready cash. Raising and shipping an army across the Channel required upfront payments for ships, supplies, weapons, and the wages of thousands of men. The crown's ordinary income from taxes was too slow and too small. This is where the Italian bankers stepped in. They offered enormous loans backed not by land but by the future. In exchange for their gold, they demanded the rights to collect specific royal taxes, like the customs duties on wool exports. They essentially bought a slice of the kingdom's future revenue. For the Peruzzi family, lending to Edward III seemed like a sound bet. They funded his early campaigns, pouring over 1,300,000 gold florins into the English war effort. Their return was a monopoly on the wool trade, allowing them to control prices and move the precious fleece from English fields to Flemish looms, skimming profit at every stage. But banking on war is a dangerous game. When Edward's fortunes wavered, he simply defaulted on his massive debts. The Peruzzi family, overextended and ruined, collapsed into bankruptcy in the 1340s. Their failure was a stark lesson, but not a deterrent. Other families, like the Medici, learned to be more sophisticated. They diversified their risk by lending to multiple sides, often through complex networks of agents and intermediaries. They might finance an English campaign through one branch of the family, while another branch arranged trade financing for a French duke. They profited from the interest regardless of who won, and more importantly, they secured priceless trade concessions, licenses, and monopolies that lasted for generations. The war was not a tragedy for them, it was a marketplace. Their hidden agenda was the relentless pursuit of financial dominance, and they achieved it by turning the battlefield into a ledger. This flow of capital created another monstrous force on the ground, the mercenary companies. When a king's loan money ran out or a truce was declared, thousands of professional soldiers were suddenly unemployed. They did not simply go home, they banded together into disciplined, ruthless corporations known as the Free Companies. Led by shrewd captains, these were businesses selling violence. They would rent their services to the highest bidder, English, French, or even a wealthy Italian city-state, switching sides as easily as changing a coat. But their most profitable periods were often the peacetime lulls. With no king paying them to fight an enemy army, they turned on the civilian population. They would seize a castle or a town, not to hold it for a crown, but to ransom it back to its terrified inhabitants. They imposed systematic protection rackets called patties on whole regions, demanding regular payments in exchange for not burning farms and slaughtering villagers. For the peasants of France, these companies were a plague more constant and terrifying than any royal army. A captain like John Hawkwood, an Englishman who became a legend in Italy, commanded a mobile fortress of several thousand hardened fighters. His loyalty was to his company's profit share, a fact well understood by the rulers who hired him. The tragic irony was circular. Italian bankers lent money to kings who paid mercenary companies to fight, who then extorted money from the people, whose taxes would eventually be pledged to repay the bankers. This financial engine ensured the war could sputter back to life whenever it suited the men with the money or the men with the swords. The true sovereigns of this era were not always the ones wearing the crowns. The battlefield was not just a place of honor, it was a harvest field. For the nobles and common soldiers of the 100 Years' War, combat was a direct path to riches, a brutal lottery where the grand prize was not territory but a person. This was the logic of the chevauchee, a French term for a specific kind of mounted raid that became the grim signature of the conflict. Picture a dark, mobile cloud of several thousand armored horsemen and their supporting infantry, not marching to besiege a castle, but sweeping through undefended countryside with terrifying speed. Their objective was simple: burn everything, steal everything, capture anyone of value. A chevauchee was economic warfare made visceral. It aimed to turn the enemy king's richest provinces into a smoldering wasteland, destroying the farms that fed his people, the mills that ground their grain, and the villages that paid his taxes. It was a message written in fire and blood. Your king cannot protect you. His rule is worthless, but for the men carrying the torches, this was more than strategy. It was their payday. A soldier's regular wages were often meager and unreliable. The real income came from plunder. A successful raid meant silks, silver plate, livestock, and wine loaded onto wagons heading back to English-held territory. Every item had a price, and every captive had a ransom value. This system transformed warfare into a decentralized, profit-driven enterprise. A common archer might dream of snatching a wealthy merchant for a modest ransom, while a knight's eyes were fixed on the ultimate quarry, another knight of equal or higher status. The capture of a high-value prisoner was a life-changing event, a jackpot that could elevate an entire family's fortunes. This explains the most stunning payday of the entire war. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the French king himself, Jean II, was taken prisoner. His captor was not a great lord, but a minor knight and his small band of men who surrounded the king's position. For King Edward III of England, this was a colossal political victory. For the knight who captured him, it was an unimaginable fortune. The king's ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, a sum so vast it was equal to twice the annual revenue of the entire English crown. While the English treasury would negotiate and collect this astronomical sum, a significant portion was promised to the actual captors. That knight and his men were set for life, their names etched into history not just for bravery but for breathtaking luck. This incident cemented a powerful idea. War was not a cost, it was an investment. A young nobleman might mortgage his lands to buy armor and horses, leading his own company of men on campaign not out of pure loyalty to his king, but as the commander of a speculative venture. He hoped to cover his debts with plunder and with one glorious capture repay them 100 times over. This plunder economy created perverse incentives. Why risk a decisive battle that could end the war when a steady stream of profitable raids could fund a comfortable existence? Why negotiate a lasting peace when captivity was a golden cage that kept the ransom payments flowing? The war persisted because, for many of the men fighting it, the conflict itself had become their profession and their profit. The true engine of this century-long struggle was not just crowns and saints, but the relentless, grinding machinery of loot. Ransom and plunder were the currencies of men, but the war's deepest conspiracies were woven in the quiet chambers of queens. While kings clashed on the battlefield, royal women navigated a far more intricate game of survival and ambition, their moves often hidden behind the throne. Take Isabella of France, a princess married to the English king Edward II as a teenager to secure a temporary peace. Her story begins not as a she-wolf, but as a pawn in a political marriage, isolated in a court that despised her French heritage and mocked her husband's blatant favoritism toward his male favorites. For years, she endured public humiliation and political sidelining, but Isabella was no passive victim. When her husband's mismanagement brought England to the brink of civil war, she saw her chance. On a diplomatic mission to her brother, the King of France, in 1325, she simply refused to return. There, she forged a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who became her lover and chief strategist. Together, they raised an army and invaded England not as foreign conquerors, but as liberators claiming to rescue the kingdom from a bad king. Their campaign was a masterclass in propaganda, winning over the English nobility who were equally fed up with Edward's rule. They deposed him, placing her young son, Edward III, on the throne with Isabella and Mortimer as the true rulers. For 3 years, she governed as the most powerful woman in England, a queen regent who controlled the treasury and dictated policy. Her hidden agenda was not just personal revenge, but securing her son's future and her own lasting authority. It was Isabella who carefully cultivated the idea of her son's right to the French crown, planting the seed of the dynastic claim that would ignite the 100 Years' War. She created the king who would start it all. Her ruthlessness, including the likely orchestration of her husband's brutal murder, earned her the nickname the She-Wolf of France from later chroniclers, a label that obscures her brilliant, calculating statecraft. She proved that a queen without a crown could still make and break kings. Decades later, another French princess found herself in a position of terrifying vulnerability, and her secret choice would reshape history in a different way. Catherine of Valois was the daughter of King Charles VI of France, the king whose madness had fractured his kingdom. She was married to the victorious Henry V of England as part of the Treaty of Troyes, a living symbol of the union between the two crowns. For a brief moment, she was Queen of England and the future Queen of France. Then Henry died suddenly, leaving her a widow at 21 with an infant son, Henry VI. In the cutthroat world of the English Regency, a young dowager queen with powerful French relatives was seen as a political threat. The English Parliament, fearing she might marry a foreign prince and create a new power bloc, passed a cruel law. It forbade her from marrying again without the king's consent, and since her son was a baby, that consent would come from the very lords who wanted her neutralized. Catherine was trapped, wealthy but powerless, a decorative prisoner in the English court. Her hidden agenda was not power, but simply a life of her own. In this stifling atmosphere, she turned to a man considered far beneath her station, a handsome Welsh squire in her household named Owen Tudor. Their relationship began in secret, a private rebellion against the cold politics that surrounded her. They married in private, a breathtakingly risky move. If discovered, it could have meant ruin for them both, as Owen had no royal blood and was seen as a mere servant. Yet this secret union was her quiet act of defiance. It gave her a family, happiness, and a measure of freedom away from the gilded cage. When she died in childbirth just a few years later, she left behind not only the infant King Henry VI, but several sons by Owen Tudor. These Tudor boys, half French princess and half Welsh gentleman, were initially kept in the background, but as the war sputtered to a close and the English royal line descended into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, their grandson would emerge from the shadows. His name was Henry Tudor, who would become King Henry VII, founding a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. The bloodline that ended the medieval period and ushered in the Renaissance was born from a dowager queen's secret marriage, a personal choice made in the long, lingering shadow of the war her family had both started and lost. Margaret of Anjou's war began not on English soil, but in the quiet desperation of a royal nursery. She was a French princess of 15 when she married the gentle, pious King Henry VI of England, a union meant to seal a fragile truce in the dying embers of the 100 Years' War. But Henry was a man unsuited for his brutal age, increasingly prone to bouts of a mysterious lethargy that left him catatonic, unable to rule. Into this vacuum of power stepped Margaret, not as a mere queen consort, but as a general, a financier, and a political mastermind. Her fierce, uncompromising leadership during the Wars of the Roses is often told as a story of English civil strife. But peel back that layer, and you find a far more personal, continental agenda burning at its core. Margaret was not just fighting for her husband's crown. She was fighting for the survival of a grand, fading dream, the dual monarchy of England and France established by the Treaty of Troyes decades earlier, the very treaty her own French ancestors had engineered. Her son, Prince Edward, was not merely the Lancastrian heir to England. He was the living symbol of that union, a boy with Plantagenet and Valois blood who represented the last, best hope to keep the French crown, or at least its influence, tied to the English line. Every battle she orchestrated, every alliance she brokered with cunning Scottish and French commanders, was an attempt to salvage this crumbling inheritance. For Margaret, losing England to the rival Yorkist faction meant more than a change of dynasty. It meant the final, irrevocable destruction of the world the Treaty of Troyes had built, a world where a single king in London could claim sovereignty from the Scottish borders to the gates of Paris. Her hidden war was a rearguard action to maintain a secret French grip on the English throne itself. She raised armies using French loans, strategized with French advisors, and saw her son's future as inextricably linked to continental power. This explains her relentless, often shocking ferocity. When the Yorkists captured and mocked her, calling her the she-wolf of France, they were not just insulting a queen. They were naming the foreign power they believed was puppeteering the weak King Henry. Her most famous act following the Yorkist victory at Wakefield was to order the execution of the captured Earl of Rutland and have his father's head mounted on the gates of York with a paper crown. This was not mere savagery. It was a calculated message of terror from a woman who believed she was defending her son's birthright against usurpers who would erase his French legacy. In the end, her war failed. Her son was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her husband died mysteriously in the Tower of London soon after, and the Yorkist Edward IV took the throne. With Margaret's defeat, the last active strand connecting the English crown to its French ambitions was severed. The 100 Years' War, which had flickered in the background of the Roses conflict, was truly, finally over. The queen who fought like a king was ultimately fighting for a ghost, a phantom kingdom that had already slipped through history's fingers. Nationalism as we understand it today simply did not exist in the 14th century. The idea that a common ploughman in Kent felt a deep, patriotic bond with a knight from Yorkshire, and that together they shared an English identity fundamentally opposed to Frenchness, is a story written backwards by later historians. In the medieval mind, primary loyalty was intensely local. You were from your village, you served your lord, you were part of your guild or your parish. The concept of a nation-state with unified cultural and political aspirations was a fiction yet to be invented. Yet, if you listen to the proclamations of kings like Edward III or Henry V, you hear the deliberate, careful construction of that very fiction. This was not an organic outpouring of national spirit. It was a calculated propaganda campaign, a hidden agenda to centralize royal power by giving scattered peoples a common enemy to hate. The English crown faced a perpetual problem. How do you convince a Cornish archer, a Midlands levyman, and a northern baron to cross the sea, risk their lives, and pay heavy taxes for a war over a crown in Paris? The answer was to craft a story that made the French not just a rival kingdom, but an existential threat to a shared way of life. This is where symbols like St. George became tools. By promoting George as a warrior saint for all of England, the crown offered a unifying figure that transcended local patron saints. His red cross on a white field became a uniform banner under which men from different regions could march, creating a visual brotherhood. The language used was deliberately inclusive and emotive. Proclamations and sermons began to speak of the English nation, defending its rights and honor against the pride of the French. This rhetoric framed the conflict not as Edward's personal legal claim, but as a defense of the entire community's interests. It was a powerful recruiting tool. A man might not care about the intricacies of Salic Law, but he could be stirred to defend English liberty against French tyranny. The French monarchy played the same game with equal skill, but they used a different, even older myth. They reached back beyond the Capetian kings, beyond Charlemagne, to the legendary origins of the Franks themselves. They invoked a lineage of fierce Germanic warriors who had conquered the land of Gaul. This Frankish identity was portrayed as pure, noble, and inherently superior. The kings of France positioned themselves not just as rulers, but as the direct heirs of these ancient conquerors, the true and natural lords of the soil. In contrast, the English kings were framed as interlopers, descendants of later Viking and Norman invaders who had no legitimate claim to this Frankish heritage. This narrative was especially potent during the low points of the war, such as after the disaster at Poitiers. It served to remind the French nobility that despite their internal squabbles, they were all Franks, united by blood and history against a foreign usurper. The genius of this strategy was its circular result. By constantly invoking a shared English or Frankish identity to fight the war, the kings actually began to create that very identity. The repeated experience of fighting together under a national banner, of hearing wartime propaganda, of sharing in the collective triumph or tragedy, slowly forged a broader sense of commonality. But the ultimate beneficiary was always the crown. As people began to think of themselves more as English or French, their loyalty subtly shifted upward from their immediate feudal lord to the king who embodied that national idea. The war, funded by plunder and fought with mercenaries, ironically became the furnace in which the modern centralized state was smelted. The king's hidden agenda was not to birth nations out of altruism, but to forge a single, powerful sword from 1,000 scattered fragments, and to ensure that the hilt rested firmly in their own hands. Language itself became the next battlefield. While kings spoke of national destiny, a quieter revolution was happening in the courtrooms of England. For centuries following the Norman conquest, the language of power in England was not English. It was French. The aristocracy spoke it, the royal court conducted its business in it, and most importantly, the law was administered in it. This created a stark divide. The common people, who spoke English or regional dialects, stood in court before judges and lawyers debating their fate in a tongue they could not understand. Their own laws were a mystery to them, spoken in the language of a foreign elite. Then, in 1362, something remarkable happened. Parliament passed the Statute of Pleading. It declared that because the French language was much unknown in the realm, all court proceedings must henceforth be conducted in English. On the surface, this was a simple act of administrative efficiency, making the law accessible to the people. But in the midst of a war against France, this was a political earthquake. It was a deliberate, calculated severing of a cultural umbilical cord. By stripping French from its privileged place in the heart of English governance, the Crown was sending an unmistakable message. To be loyal to England, to participate in its justice and its growing state, you must now do so in English. This was a direct challenge to the Anglo-Norman nobility, many of whom still held lands in France and felt deep ties to French culture. The statute forced them to choose. They could cling to the language of their ancestors and risk being seen as outsiders in their own country, or they could embrace English and align themselves fully with the new national project. The Crown was not just simplifying the law, it was forging a new administrative identity, one defined in opposition to the enemy across the Channel. Language was no longer just a means of communication, it was a tool of unification and exclusion. To speak English in court was to perform your loyalty. This move had a powerful side effect. As English became the language of official record, it began to standardize and gain prestige. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote his Canterbury Tales in the English of the London court a generation later, were building on this foundation. The Crown's hidden agenda to centralize power was inadvertently giving birth to a literary culture that would, in time, define the English spirit far more than any battle. The war was not just fought with arrows and alliances, but with words and grammar quietly reshaping what it meant to belong. The war for crowns and languages was also a war of tools, a relentless competition where the blacksmith's forge became as important as the knight's charger. This was the hidden military-industrial complex of the Middle Ages, an agenda of innovation driven by desperate necessity and the promise of immense profit. At its heart was a simple piece of wood and string that reshaped the world. The English longbow was not a new invention, but its systematic adoption created a social and tactical revolution. Crafted from yew, often imported from Spain or Italy, a full war bow stood as tall as a man and required a lifetime of training to master. The physical strength needed to draw its 180-pound pull deformed the skeletons of veteran archers, their shoulders and spines bearing witness to their craft. This weapon democratized the battlefield in a way that terrified the aristocratic elite. A humble yeoman farmer, trained from boyhood, could now launch a steel-tipped arrow that could pierce plate armor at 200 yards, felling a mounted knight who had trained for 20 years and whose armor cost a fortune. The victories at Crécy and Agincourt were not just English triumphs, they were the triumph of a new economic and military model. The Crown recognized this power and enforced it by law. Royal decrees mandated that every Englishman practice archery on Sundays, banning other sports like football that might distract from this vital national duty. The longbowman became a state-sponsored asset, his skill cultivated and harvested for war. This created a whole professional class, the bowires who crafted the bows and the fletchers who made the arrows, whose workshops were deemed essential to national security. Their trade was protected, their materials subsidized, turning them into wealthy, crucial pillars of the war machine. But for every new weapon, a new defense arises. The longbow's dominance sparked a frantic arms race in personal armor. Smiths across Europe worked to defeat the bodkin arrow, developing hardened steel plates, curved surfaces to deflect blows, and intricate articulating joints. The iconic suit of full-plate armor, a masterpiece of metallurgy and engineering, was a direct and expensive response to the threat of the common archer. This technological duel flowed upward to the very landscape. The soaring stone castles of the early Middle Ages, with their tall towers and thick walls, were designed to withstand sieges by trebuchets and scaling ladders. But they had a fatal weakness. Their vertical surfaces were perfect targets for the new kings of siegecraft cannons. The development of gunpowder artillery was slow and erratic, but by the final stages of the war it had become decisive. Massive bombards like the Mons Meg used later by the Scots could hurl stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds to smash castle walls into rubble. This rendered the old fortress designs obsolete almost overnight. The response was a new architectural agenda, the Trace Italien or Star Fort. Walls became lower, thicker, and sloped to deflect cannon shot, surrounded by complex earthworks and angled bastions that allowed defenders to rake attackers with their own guns. The master masons and military engineers who understood these new principles, men like the French brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau, became the most valuable and highly paid consultants in Europe. They sold their expertise to the highest bidder, moving from kingdom to kingdom, designing defenses that could bankrupt a treasury. The war had birthed a new economy of destruction, where the real power lay not only with the men who wielded the weapons, but with the quiet geniuses in the workshop and the drafting room who invented them. A king's most valuable weapon was often a scrap of parchment delivered in the dead of night. Behind the thunder of cavalry charges and the groan of siege engines, the 100 Years' War was fought in whispers, a shadow conflict where information was a currency more valuable than any ransom. Both the English and French crowns maintained intricate networks of spies, scouts, and diplomats whose sole purpose was to see the invisible and hear the silent. These were not full-time agents in the modern sense, but a fluid collection of merchants, disgruntled clerks, wandering minstrels, and even corrupt priests, all willing to trade secrets for silver or favor. Their reports shaped the fate of kingdoms, turning the murky world of medieval espionage into a decisive, hidden front. Consider the simple merchant traveling between Bordeaux and Paris. His carts were laden with wine and cloth, but tucked within a bale of wool might be a coded report on the morale and supply levels of a French garrison. A wandering friar, protected by the sanctity of his order, could move freely across battle lines, his ears open to the gossip of taverns and the loose tongues of soldiers around a campfire. These informal informants were the lifeblood of early intelligence, their observations collated by royal clerks into a rough picture of enemy strength and intention. But as the war dragged on, the systems grew more sophisticated. Both sides began to employ dedicated masters of espionage, officials tasked with recruiting, running, and paying networks of assets. In England, figures like the enigmatic King's Spy, a shadowy position often held by a trusted confidant, were given secret budgets to manage these operations. Their names rarely appear in the chronicles, their work designed to be invisible, but their influence was profound. The intelligence they sought fell into three crucial categories. First and most obvious were military secrets. Where was the enemy army mustering? How many men did they have? Were they well supplied or starving and ripe for attack? A single accurate report from a scout observing dust clouds on a distant road could allow a commander to choose the perfect ground for an ambush or avoid a catastrophic engagement. Second was political intelligence from within the enemy's court. Which noble was discontent with the king, who was angling for more power? Could they be bribed or persuaded to switch sides, or at least to delay their support? The defection of the Gascon lords or the Burgundian alliance were not sudden surprises. They were the culmination of years of careful cultivation, secret meetings, and promised rewards, all orchestrated by diplomats who were, in essence, spies in fine clothing. The third category was economic. Was a region suffering from poor harvests, making it vulnerable? Were trade routes being disrupted, putting pressure on a city to surrender? Understanding the financial health of the enemy was key to planning the devastating chevauchee raids that targeted wealth itself. To communicate this sensitive information, agents developed clever methods of tradecraft. Ciphers and coded phrases were common. A seemingly innocent merchant's letter discussing the price of wool might contain a pre-arranged pattern of words that revealed a troop count. Invisible ink made from milk or fruit juices could conceal a true message between the lines of a pious greeting. The most secure method was the trusted human courier, who would memorize a message and recite it only to its intended recipient. Bribery was the universal key that unlocked doors. A guard could be paid to leave a postern gate unbarred. A castle steward might be bribed to report on his lord's correspondence. Even a humble servant in a noble household could provide priceless details about their master's plans and temperament. This created a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia, where kings trusted only their innermost circle, and even then with suspicion. The fear of betrayal was constant, because betrayal was simply good business for the man selling the secret. The stakes of this shadow war were demonstrated with terrifying clarity in the year 1415. As King Henry V of England marched his army through Normandy toward what would become the field of Agincourt, his survival depended on superior intelligence. He used swift, mounted scouts to constantly probe the movements of the far larger French force, giving him time to choose a narrow, muddy battlefield that neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage. He likely had informants within the French camp who reported on the arguments and overconfidence among the French nobility, their chaotic chain of command, and their decision to attack on ground that favored the English archers. Henry did not just stumble upon a lucky position. He was guided there by a web of invisible eyes and ears, turning information into a force multiplier that made his legendary victory possible. In the silent trade of secrets, knowledge was not just power, it was the difference between a crown and a coffin. A king could burn a field, but he could not command the wind. The most terrifying hidden agenda of the 100 Years' War involved weaponizing forces far beyond human control, turning the very environment and the unseen world of disease into instruments of conquest. This was warfare that targeted not just armies, but the land that fed them and the bodies that housed them, a chilling prelude to strategies we would recognize today. The most direct method was the deliberate scorched earth policy, a tactic of terrifying simplicity. When an English chevauchee swept through the French countryside, its goal was not always to seize territory. Often it was to render territory useless. Soldiers would systematically burn crops still standing in the fields, torch grain stores in barns, and poison wells by tossing in animal carcasses. They would chop down fruit trees and vineyards, destroying harvests for years to come. This was economic warfare made visceral, but it was also environmental sabotage on a massive scale. The agenda was to create a desert around the enemy, a buffer zone of starvation that would cripple the French king's ability to feed his population and, crucially, to fund his armies through local taxes. The blackened fields and smoking villages were a message written in ash. The land itself was now a participant in the war, and it was fighting for England. For the peasants who worked that land, this was an apocalypse. Their entire world, the source of their food, their livelihood, and their ancestors' bones, was turned into a weapon against them. They were not collateral damage, they were the primary target. Starving a region meant creating refugees, spreading disease, and inciting social unrest that could topple a lord or even pressure a king to sue for peace. The environment was not a backdrop to the conflict. It was a theater of operations, but a far more sinister and controversial theory suggests that biological agents were also deliberately unleashed. In the mid-14th century, a catastrophe swept across Europe that dwarfed the war itself. The Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population. Its arrival neatly intersected with the Hundred Years' War, and at the intersection lies a single, infamous event. The port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Black Sea, was under siege in 1346 by the army of the Mongol Golden Horde. As the story goes, the Mongol forces were themselves stricken by the plague. In a brutal act of desperation or tactical innovation, their commander, Janibeg, ordered the corpses of his own dead soldiers to be catapulted over the city walls. The aim was to sicken the defenders and force surrender. Shortly after, Genoese ships fleeing the stricken city carried the disease westward to Mediterranean ports like Messina and Genoa, from where it exploded across Europe. If this account is true, the siege of Kaffa represents one of the earliest documented instances of intentional biological warfare. The hidden agenda here was not just to win a siege, but to weaponize a pathogen. The consequences were world-altering. The demographic collapse caused by the plague had profound military effects. It created severe labor shortages, driving up the cost of soldiers and making the expensive professional armies of the later war period a necessity. It shattered the old feudal order, as peasants who survived could demand better wages and more rights. Entire noble lines were wiped out, changing the political landscape overnight. For the warring kingdoms, the plague was a chaotic, unpredictable force that paused major campaigns and killed kings and commoners alike. But the chilling question remains. Did the knowledge of Kaffa's horror spread with the plague itself? Could the idea of using sickness as a siege weapon have entered the military consciousness of Europe? While there is no direct evidence of plague corpses being used on the battlefields of France, the principle of spreading terror and disease was already in practice. Polluting water sources and leaving rotting carcasses in besieged areas were standard, if crude, tactics to weaken resistance. The line between environmental scorching and biological attack was perilously thin. Whether by the catapulted corpse or the poisoned well, the war revealed a grim truth. In the struggle for ultimate advantage, nothing was considered sacred, not the harvest, not the water, and certainly not the dead. The true cruelty of a siege lay in its slow, predictable rhythm. A commander did not simply surround a castle and wait for a flag to be raised. He orchestrated a deliberate symphony of despair where starvation was the principal instrument. The hidden goal was not merely to capture stone walls, but to shatter the human spirit inside, ensuring that when the gates finally opened, the survivors would be too broken to ever rebel again. This was psychological warfare waged with empty bellies. The besieging army would construct elaborate lines of circumvallation, trenches, and wooden palisades that completely encircled the stronghold, cutting off all contact with the outside world. No grain carts could enter, no messengers could slip out. The castle or town was turned into a sealed jar, and inside, time itself became the enemy. The first weeks might pass with a semblance of normalcy, as stores of grain and salted meat were rationed. But as months dragged on, the calculus grew grim. Commanders inside the walls faced impossible choices. Do you feed the soldiers to keep them fighting, or the civilians to prevent riot? Do you slaughter the valuable war horses for meat, knowing you may need them for a desperate breakout? Chroniclers describe the descent into horror with chilling uniformity. First, the cats and dogs disappeared. Then the rats became a precious source of protein. Finally, stories emerged of the unthinkable, of survivors resorting to cannibalism. These tales, whether fully true or partly propaganda, served the besiegers' purpose perfectly. They spread terror among other towns, making them more likely to surrender at the mere sight of an approaching army. The agenda was to make resistance synonymous with annihilation, but there was a colder, long-term political calculation at work here. A population starved into submission was a population reshape. When the siege ended, the victor would often distribute food from his own stores, appearing not as a conqueror but as a savior. This calculated mercy was a powerful tool for transferring loyalty. The people, broken by their own lord's inability to protect them, would now look to the new master who held the bread. Their allegiance, forged in hunger, could be redirected. Furthermore, a thoroughly broken garrison and townsfolk were easier to govern. They lacked the physical strength and the collective will to mount an insurrection. The siege, in this light, was a brutal but efficient method of social engineering. It drained a community of its defiant energy, leaving behind a pliable populace that would accept new taxes, new laws, and a new sovereign, simply grateful for the chance to eat. This explains why some sieges were pursued with such relentless patience, even when a direct assault might have been possible. The assault would cost the attacker soldiers. The siege cost him only time, while it cost the defender everything. The famine was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the point. By mastering the logistics of starvation, a clever commander could conquer a territory and its people's minds in one sustained, silent campaign. Peace was a weapon sharper than any sword. In the long pauses between the thunder of battles, men in fine robes gathered, not to end the war, but to manage it. They were the peace profiteers, and their hidden agenda was not an end to fighting, but the strategic use of quiet. Consider John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford. He was the younger brother of the heroic Henry V, and after the king's sudden death, Bedford became the regent of English-occupied France, governing in the name of his infant nephew, Henry VI. Bedford is often portrayed as a loyal administrator, holding the line for the Lancastrian dream, but look at his actions through the lens of personal ambition. His peace was not about reconciliation with the Valois French. It was about consolidation. Bedford married Anne of Burgundy, sister to the powerful Duke Philip, in a brilliant move that shored up the vital Burgundian alliance. He spent years meticulously building a functional, profitable government in Normandy and the north of France, imposing English law, settling English colonists on confiscated lands, and ensuring taxes flowed smoothly back to his coffers. For Bedford, periods of truce were not a prelude to surrender. They were a chance to cement facts on the ground, to make English rule so normal, so efficient, and so lucrative that it would become irreversible. His peace was a tool for permanent conquest, a quiet campaign to make the population forget they had ever been French. He was building a state within a state, and his power and wealth depended entirely on that state's survival. The war could not end because his entire political existence was built upon its continuation. This pattern repeated with other powerful figures. Merchants in London and Bordeaux who thrived on the wartime wine and wool trade feared a lasting peace would disrupt their monopolies and special privileges granted by a needy crown. For them, a state of managed conflict with secure supply lines and controlled markets was more profitable than true peace with its unpredictable free trade. Even the mercenary captains, the men who led the free companies, had a stake in perpetual war. Long truces put them out of work. They would often lobby or even provoke incidents to ensure the funding for soldiers never fully dried up. For all these groups, peace was merely a different kind of warfare, waged with treaties and tariffs instead of trebuchets. Yet within this cynical landscape, there flickered a truly revolutionary agenda, one that died in its cradle. It was the lost chance for a permanent dual monarchy. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 was not just a Burgundian plot, it was a constitutional bombshell. It declared that the crowns of England and France would be forever united under one king, first Henry V and then his heirs. This was not a temporary occupation or a personal union. It was a blueprint for a single, unified kingdom spanning the Channel. Imagine the Europe that might have been. a realm combining England's naval power and parliamentary tradition with France's vast population, agricultural wealth, and continental influence. This entity would have dwarfed any other power in Western Europe overnight. The hidden agenda here was not conquest but merger. Proponents like Bedford likely saw it as the only way to finally end the cycle of violence that had lasted for generations. If both nations shared a king, a court, and a common foreign policy, the reason for the war would vanish. The borders would dissolve. The resources spent on armies could turn to trade and building. It was a visionary, if brutally imposed, plan for lasting stability. For a few brief years under Bedford's capable regency, it almost worked. The dual administration functioned. But this grand agenda required two impossible things. First, it required the French people to accept the permanent disinheritance of their Valois prince, Charles VII. This they never did, especially once Joan of Arc reignited the symbolic flame of French sacred kingship. Second, and more fatally, it required the English to fully commit to becoming a continental power, to think of Paris as their capital as much as London. But the English political community, the parliament that held the purse strings, grew weary of the endless expense. They saw France as a drain, a bottomless pit for English lives and gold. The dream of a dual monarchy was ultimately a king's dream, not a people's dream. It died with the collapse of the Burgundian alliance and the slow, grinding French reconquest. By the time the war sputtered to an end in 1453, the only territory England retained was the pale port of Calais. The grand vision of a united kingdom was reduced to a footnote, a haunting what-if. The peace profiteers had secured their temporary gains, but the true peace, the one that could have reshaped a continent, was lost to the shorter, sharper agendas of the men who could not see beyond the next campaign season. The Treaty of Troyes was a masterpiece of legal destruction. On parchment, it wove a grand narrative of peace and union, but its clauses were surgical tools designed to excise the Valois dynasty from history. The most famous provision named King Henry V of England and his heirs as the successors to the mad King Charles VI of France, yet this was merely the headline. The true venom lay in the meticulous disinheritance of the Dauphin, Charles. The treaty did not just pass him over, it legally erased him. It declared him unfit to rule, citing his involvement in the atrocious crime of the assassination of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy on the bridge at Montereau. This was not a simple accusation. It was a piece of brilliant legal propaganda, transforming a dynastic rival into a morally bankrupt criminal, forever barred from the throne by his own supposed wickedness. The treaty stated Charles had made himself unworthy of any succession, cutting him off not only from the crown, but from any claim of legitimacy. His very name was to be removed from the royal lineage, a phantom prince in his own kingdom. This clause was the heart of the Burgundian agenda, delivering the vengeance Duke Philip the Good craved for his father's murder. But the treaty looked beyond vengeance to a cold new reality. It laid out a detailed blueprint for governance, a hidden constitution for occupied France. Henry V was not merely named heir. He was appointed regent of the kingdom immediately, with full authority to rule in Charles VI's name while the old king lived. This created a dual monarchy in practice long before it would exist in title. The treaty specified that Henry would use French officials and customary law to administer the realm, a crucial concession meant to make English rule palatable. However, all key fortresses and cities were to be garrisoned by English troops, and the finances of the realm were to be directed toward the expulsion of the said Charles. The document essentially created a self-funding war machine. Taxes from the French people would pay for the armies used to hunt down their rightful prince, a vicious circle of conquest financed by the conquered. The role of Burgundy was the treaty's silent cornerstone. While Henry was granted regency, true power in the north and east, the Burgundian sphere, flowed through Duke Philip. The treaty bound Henry to govern with the Council of the Estates General and the notables of the kingdom, A group Burgundy could dominate. More importantly, it secured Burgundian territories, granting them exceptional autonomy and confirming Philip's control over his vast lands without the traditional homage owed to the French crown. For Philip, this was the perfect outcome. He would have a weak, half-English king on the throne in Paris, a monarch dependent on Burgundian support, while he himself ruled a virtually independent state. The treaty was his ultimate weapon, using English arms to shatter his French enemies while placing a puppet king over the ruins. It was conquest by contract, an attempt to make a secret ambition permanent with ink and seals. The marriage clause, uniting Henry to Charles's daughter Catherine, was the final symbolic lock on this new order. Their future child would embody the union, a living treaty with royal blood from both lines. Yet this grand design contained its own fatal flaw. It treated a kingdom as a piece of property to be transferred, ignoring the deep, stubborn loyalty a people could hold for a disinherited prince, especially one anointed by God. The Treaty of Troyes was the ultimate expression of hidden agendas, a document that believed you could legislate a nation out of existence. But a signature on a page, no matter how shrewd, could not erase a crown from a people's heart. The final English garrison in Bordeaux surrendered in the autumn of 1453. There was no grand treaty, no formal ceremony of defeat. The 100 Years' War simply stopped like a clock whose mainspring had finally quietly snapped. After 116 years, the Plantagenet dream of a dual monarchy lay in ruins. The only French soil left in English hands was the pale, lonely port of Calais, a ghostly souvenir of an empire that had evaporated. So who actually won? The answer is not found on a map, but in the hidden agendas that survived the carnage. Some succeeded beyond their architects' wildest hopes, while others collapsed into dust. The greatest victor was not a king, but an institution. The English Parliament emerged from the ashes with its power permanently transformed. For over a century, kings had been forced to beg Parliament for the extraordinary taxes needed to fund the war. Each request required negotiation, and each negotiation chipped away at royal authority. Parliament learned to attach conditions to its grants, demanding audits of war spending and greater influence over policy. By the war's end, the principle was cemented. The crown could not levy major taxes without parliamentary consent. This hidden shift in constitutional power, born from financial desperation, would echo for centuries, shaping England's political destiny far more than any territorial claim on the continent. In France, a different kind of centralization triumphed. The Valois monarchy, having expelled the foreign claimant, was now unchallenged. The war provided the perfect excuse to dismantle the old feudal order. The crown seized the lands of nobles who had collaborated with the English, imposed permanent direct taxes like the taille, and created a standing professional army loyal only to the king. The very conflict that nearly destroyed France forged it into a more unified, powerful, and absolute state. The agenda of building a modern nation, so carefully nurtured by royal propaganda, was at last fulfilled. Yet for the Dukes of Burgundy, the outcome was bittersweet. Their agenda of sovereign autonomy succeeded magnificently for a generation. Philip the Good ruled a state richer and more cultured than either England or France, a middle kingdom in all but name. But this triumph contained the seeds of its own destruction. By helping to crush England, Burgundy removed the counterweight that had kept the French crown in check. Once the English threat was gone, France turned its full, vengeful attention to the overmighty Duke within its own borders. Within a few decades, the Burgundian dream would be shattered on the battlefield, its lands divided, its independence erased. The gamble to use the war for autonomy ultimately created the very monster that consumed it. The economic agendas left a landscape of utter devastation. The wool trade that had sparked the conflict was permanently disrupted, with new centers of production rising in Spain and Italy. Both kingdoms were financially exhausted, their populations depleted, their countryside scarred by decades of scorched earth raids. The war profiteers, the bankers and mercenary captains had moved on to fresher conflicts in Italy, leaving the common people to rebuild from nothing. In England, this toxic combination of financial ruin, military humiliation, and a weak king, Henry VI, whose very claim was now tainted by failure, created a volatile vacuum. The noble factions that had once competed for glory and loot in France now turned their battle-hardened soldiers and private armies against each other at home, fighting over the only crown left to them. The Wars of the Roses were not a separate conflict. They were the final, bloody spasm of the 100 Years' War, its unresolved agendas playing out on English soil. The dream of a French crown was dead, but the hunger for power it had cultivated was very much alive. This sprawling conflict was never a single, simple war. It was a tangled web of secret wars, each strand pulling in a different direction, yet somehow holding the whole terrible structure together for more than a century. Picture a vast, animated map of Europe, but instead of showing armies, it reveals a shimmering, interconnected network of motives. A golden thread of wool runs from English hills to Flemish looms, then transforms into a river of silver coins flowing into royal treasuries. From those treasuries, crimson lines of funding shoot out to mercenary captains and Italian bankers, whose own threads weave back to the wool trade, creating a closed, self-perpetuating loop of money and violence. Overlaying this economic web is a lattice of royal bloodlines, the dynastic claims pulsing like a heartbeat. But then, cutting across these neat lines, you see the jagged, personal ambitions of men like the Black Prince, building his private kingdom, and Philip the Good of Burgundy, weaving his own sovereign state from strands of betrayal. Each node in this web, every duke, every banker, every ambitious queen was fighting their own hidden war. The English king fought for a crown to protect an economy. The French king fought to unify a realm and crush overmighty subjects. The Gascon lord fought only for the preservation of his own castle and privileges. The mercenary captain fought for the next profitable contract. Their goals were not aligned. In fact, they were often in direct opposition. The Burgundian agenda of autonomy directly sabotaged the English agenda of dual monarchy. The Black Prince's dream of a tax-rich principality drove his subjects into the arms of the French crown, undermining his father's greater war. This is the crucial, counterintuitive truth. The war lasted so long not because one side was overwhelmingly powerful, but because the secret agendas were perpetually out of sync. Just as one king's objective seemed within reach, the private ambition of a key ally would shift, unraveling years of progress. A truce beneficial to the crowns in London and Paris would be disastrous for the mercenary companies and the war financiers, who would then work to reignite hostilities. Peace was bad for business, and in this war, everything was a business. The network of secrets created a form of terrible equilibrium. No single actor could achieve total victory because the moment they came close, another actor in the web, pursuing a completely different prize, would pull the entire structure in a new direction. The 100 Years' War was less a boxing match between two nations and more a chaotic, century-long bar fight where everyone had a different enemy and a different reason for throwing a punch. The only thing they all agreed on was that the fighting itself for a time served their separate, hidden ends. When those ends finally diverged irreparably, when the Burgundians calculated peace was more profitable than war, when the English Parliament refused to pour more gold into the continental pit, when the last of the plunder dried up, the web finally tore apart and the long war simply ceased to be. The most shocking secret was never a single plot, but the sheer number of them, all operating at once. The war you learned as a dynastic struggle was, in truth, a brutal economic campaign fought over English wool and Flemish cloth. It was the story of Burgundy, a French duchy that coldly betrayed its own king to carve out a sovereign kingdom from the chaos. It was the quiet triumph of Italian bankers who funded both sides, turning human suffering into ledgers of profit. And hovering at the edges is the grim possibility that the war's greatest horror, the Black Death itself, may have been intentionally unleashed as a weapon during the Siege of Kaffa. These are not footnotes, they are the true engines of a conflict that lasted 116 years. History is rarely about simple causes. It is a tangled web of human ambition, greed, and survival, where the official story is often just a banner under which secret armies march. So the next time you hear about a war fought for honor or crown, remember the 100 Years' War and ask what they are not telling you. Which of these hidden agendas surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries of our past.